Those stories shortly, but first our big discussion tonight, the U.S.-Syria conflict. A U.S. warplane shot down a Syrian army jet on Sunday in Raqqa. Washington says the jet dropped bombs near U.S.-backed forces, and Damascus says the plane was downed while flying a mission against ISIS. So it is a blame game. Syrian media reports the plane crashed and the pilot was missing. One of the first times the U.S. has downed a Syrian jet since the conflict started in 2011. Syria says the U.S. attack is to undermine the efforts of the Syrian army when they were making advances against Daesh. But the U.S. Central Command says the plane was downed in a self-defense strategy of the Syrian Democratic Forces. This when a Syrian army jet later dropped bombs near the U.S.-backed forces. A USS Super Hornet shot it down. The U.S. has now escalated its bombing in northern Syria. And it's also captured several districts from militants. Syria's army, which has taken territory from ISIS in eastern Aleppo, has now moved into Raqqa and seized back some of the oil fields as well as the villages that were under militant control for 3 years. So quite a bit of blame game happening between Syria and the U.S. and now Russia also meddling in. So let's get perspective on this. The downing of this Syrian fighter jet in the airspace, well, is now an act of war. The U.S. military commander in Syria and Iraq are taking such decisions without regard to the political ramifications. As we mentioned, Russia has now hit back, saying all U.S. fighters over the war zone are now targets. Here's the report.
The downing of a Syrian Air Force fighter by the US adds a potentially new destabilizing element to the current war in Syria. The US claimed that it acted under rules of engagement, shooting down the Syrian fighter when it bombed America's Kurdish allies fighting the Islamic State in Tabqa, south of Raqqa. But the US has no mandate to operate in Syria. There is no mandate either from the United Nations. And there is no invitation from the Syrian government to the Americans to fight the Islamic State.
Мы призываем Соединенные Штаты и всех других, кто имеет свои силы или своих советников на земле, обеспечивать скоординированность в нашей работе. Зоны деэскалации являются одним из возможных вариантов совместного продвижения вперед. Приглашаем всех.
The Americans could claim self-defense since some of their special forces trainers are embedded with Kurdish forces, but their presence on the ground is again illegal. Along with the downing of the Syrian fighter, it could be seen as an act of war against Syria. Such actions are generally authorized by the political executive in democracies like the US. But President Donald Trump has given his Defense Secretary James Mattis and the Pentagon freedom to act, whether in Syria or Afghanistan. In a sense, military commanders are now taking political decisions and are okaying the use of a wide range of weapons. Russia has hit back, warning it could target any US or coalition fighter operating over the battle zone. It said there was no communication from the US before the Syrian jet was shot down and said it was ending all cooperation with the US. Bureau Report, WION.
All right, to get perspective on this story, the U.S.-Syria conflict, we're joined in the studio by Dr. Riad Abbas, the ambassador to Syria. Also, our correspondent, Ramesh Ramachandran, here in New Delhi, who was recently in Syria, as well as former intelligence officer Glenn Carl, standing by from the United States. Certainly a hot topic. Everybody is discussing this. Let's get right into this. We'll start with Dr. Abbas. What is the motivation for the U.S. doing this right now? Give us some perspective. Dr. Abbas?
My dear, this operation proves for us America would like to support IS in the ground. We announced that since long time, but nobody believed. Now it happened, and you have seen who fight against IS in the ground, Syrian army. Why it came now? Why America hit our army in the ground if our army hit IS? That is mean American directly now would like to confess on face against our army who fight against IS. And proves also for us American alliance since 3 years ago, they are joking on us. They don't fight terror group in the ground. Within 3 days, our army reached the border of Iraq and defeat IS in the ground. And the follower of America filled the battle in the ground. That is why America it came directly against our army and throw down these airjet Syrian forces.
All right, let me get back to Ramesh in just a moment. I want to go to Glenn Carl standing by. Glenn, this is the first time, in fact, that the U.S. forces have shot down a military jet of sorts. I mean, can the U.S. just operate like this anywhere? There's no legal rulings that allow this. There's no UN mandate. So what business does the United States have to shoot down a Syrian jet, even if it is claiming to be self-defense? I mean, all of this in the name of fighting ISIS. Glenn?
Well, I suppose we should ask the State Department lawyers for the legal defense, which I'm sure has been enunciated over the last 6 years. Since Syria collapsed. I gather you could argue that as ISIS had attacked Iraq and the United States is supporting Iraq, these are actions to reestablish some sort of status quo or be acts of defense. The specific tactical answer is pretty straightforward, as opposed to what we just heard, which is that coalition forces, anti-ISIS coalition forces around Raqqa, are supported by the United States, with some American forces present, were attacked by the Syrian Air Force, and that came very close to the American forces, and they as had borne they would do, shot down the airplane. It's also true the United States has called for years for the replacement of the Syrian regime, but this is the first time the U.S. has, or U.S.-backed forces, directly gone after any element of the Syrian military itself, as opposed to what we just heard. The United States is hardly supporting. I shouldn't laugh because this is such a hideous situation, but the U.S. has been supporting forces opposing ISIS while calling for the replacement of the Syrian regime, but not directly opposing the Syrian regime with force at this point.
All right, let me go to Ramesh Ramachandran standing by here in the New Delhi studio. Ramesh, you were in fact recently in Syria. You were on the ground there in many places, Palmyra, Damascus, Homs as well. What was it like actually there on the ground? You know, we see it through the reports, we see what happens, and then we hear the blame game, of course, if we'd like to call it. But what was the situation there like on the ground? Were there in fact advances being made to thwart off ISIS?
Indeed, Archit, this is a classic attempt, or straight from the American playbook, to draw and redraw the map in West Asia, or Middle East as others call it. And Syria, what is happening in Syria today is a classic example of it. The America is on the decline, and Syria has exposed the limits of American influence in the region, and we can see how the US is trying to claw its way back into the game, as it were, in West Asia. But that said, we've seen, within Syria, the towns and cities change hands between the government forces and the opposition, especially the Daesh or the Islamic State, in the last few months and years. But of late, the Syrian armed forces are gaining ground. They're closing in on Raqqa, the de facto capital of the Islamic State. And the question to be asked today is, why is the US trying to escalate matters now at a time when the government armed forces are closing in on Raqqa? So what could be the motivation for the Americans to do what they're doing in Syria today?
Exactly. The big question, why now? Why all of this happening right now? In fact, Ramesh, you spoke to Syria's President Bashar al-Assad in an exclusive interview with WION. Let's listen into parts of that conversation where he talked about his views on terrorism, ISIS, and much more. Let's listen in.
Now, by all accounts, Mr. President, it is the biggest humanitarian crisis of our time. And hundreds of thousands of people, including innocent people, have been killed in this war, in this conflict. So how is this campaign of yours against terrorist groups such as the Islamic State progressing?
Thank you for coming to Syria. And you're coming at a time where the situation has improved dramatically, let's say, because the terrorist groups, mainly ISIS and al-Nusra and like-minded groups in Syria, who are Wahhabi terrorist extremist groups, are retreating, or let's say the area under their control has been shrinking. So the situation on the ground from military point of view is much better than before, but it's not the whole picture. It's not only about military conflict, it's about different things, about the ideology that they try to spread in our region, which is the most dangerous challenge that we may face in the mid and long term. Second, it's about the support that those terrorist groups have been gaining from regional countries like Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, and European and Western countries like United States, France, and UK mainly, which mark a new era in the world where you can use terrorism, any kind of terrorism, to implement political agenda. This is something more dangerous than any other danger that we may face in our modern world.
Mr. President, you mentioned about the United States. Now, we know that you had historical differences, if I can put it that way, with the American administrations, subsequent American administrations. But the US President Donald Trump has just completed his inaugural tour of West Asia, as it were, or Middle East, as others call it. Is Donald Trump someone you think you can do business with?
The problem in the United States is about the whole political system. It's not about one person. Trump's election has proven again for us, again and again, that the president is only a performer. He's not the decision maker. He's part of different lobbies and the deep state, or the deep regime, as we can call it, who implement and dictate on the president what should he be doing. And the proof to what I'm saying, that Trump, after he became president, he swallowed most of the promises and the word that he was boasting during his campaign. He made 180 turn in nearly every promise. So why? Because the deep state wouldn't allow him to go in certain direction. That's why, for me, dealing with him as a person, it could be, but can that person deliver? No. In the United States, president cannot deliver. The whole state, the deep state only, is the one who can deliver. And this is the problem. This deep state doesn't accept partners around the world. They only accept puppets. They only accept followers. They only accept proxies. That's what they accept. We're not any of these.
Mr. President, when we talk about terrorism and its ideology, one can't but talk about the Wahhabi, or the influx or influence of Wahhabism on countries around the world, especially in West Asia. And now, when we talk specifically about countries such as Saudi Arabia, some commentators say that while Saudi Arabia successfully deflected criticism from its own actions, it redirects the criticism to countries such as Iran in the neighborhood.
To be precise, the word deflect is not precise for one reason, because when the Saud family created this kingdom, they created it in cooperation and in coordination with the Wahhabi institution. So it's one institution. The Wahhabi institution, the extremism, or the extremists in Saudi Arabia defend this state because it's their state, it's their own states. So it's one. You cannot talk about terrorism and Saud family as two entities. I have to be very frank with you. That's why they didn't deflect. They exported the terrorism or the extremism or the Wahhabi ideology to the rest of the world. Nearly every madrasa in Asia, in Europe, every mosque has been supported financially and ideologically through books and through every other mean by the Wahhabi institution. That's why I wouldn't say no, they didn't deflect, they exported.
And talking specifically about the ongoing campaign against the Islamic State or Daesh, how many more months would you give the Daesh before it's pushed out of your sovereign territory?
If you want to talk about our war, regardless of the influence of the external wars, ISIS is not very strong. It will take few months, even with al-Nusra. Now, the problem that ISIS has been supported by the United States. The United States attacked our army that's been fighting ISIS 3 times during the last 6 months or so. And every time they attack our forces in that area, ISIS attacked our forces at the same time and took over that area. So the realistic answer is that depends on how much international support ISIS will get. That's my answer.
So, Mr. President, is the worst behind you?
I hope so. I hope. I mean, because things now moving in the right direction, which is a better direction, because we are defeating the terrorists. Unless the West and other countries and their puppets support those extremists in a very, how to say, massive way, I'm sure the worst is behind us.
We asked Assad a few weeks ago, is the worst behind him? But perhaps he wasn't sure what was going to happen. Let me go back to Dr. Abbas here, standing by in the studio. Let's talk about the U.S.'s role, the Obama era versus the Trump era. How much of a departure do you think it is going to be with a Trump leadership in the White House in dealing with the conflict in Syria, in your opinion?
We don't believe in American policy in Middle East. There is no different view on our eyes between the Department of Obama or the Department of Mr. Trump. They have the same policy on Middle East, and we don't believe their policy. And we are against their plan in Middle East because always they follow their interest and they don't look for the interest of our Syrian people and Palestinian people in those areas. We know why they came to our ground now. They know, we know very well their aims in our ground. They need to control the border between Syria and Iraq and to support the terror groups which created by them against those countries who are against their policy in Middle East. They came to Syria to support those terror groups, and Mr. Trump continues the same policy of Mr. Obama. Maybe somebody will say this soft policy and this strong policy, but they are the same. We don't believe American policy in this area, and they will not reach their aim because our country, our leaders, our president, our people will not allow them, and we are not able to surrender our sovereignty. When we finish from defeating ISIS in the ground, they will see what will happen on them. They have to go back to their to the history and to get this to read this lesson which they get from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Lebanon. They will face the same problem in future when we defeat their group in the ground.
All right, let me go back to Glenn Carl standing by as well. Glenn, you heard Dr. Abbas, Syrian ambassador, talk about the American policy, regardless if it's Obama or if it's Trump, that Syria disagrees with the American policy. But I understand a different opinion on the American side on its agenda to crush groups like ISIS.
Yes, I think it's perfectly legitimate to criticize American policy. There are any number of criticisms one can make for many of the American steps or missteps. That's true. To say that the United States supports, foments, backs ISIS is just patent nonsense. It's also true, part of the larger attempt at creating a narrative is that Syria has, since the Civil War, we'll call it, began, and since ISIS arose, the Syrian government has tried to paint this in a simple, polarized, we represent the state and the people against the terrible terrorists. And there is truth to that. ISIS is hideous, and ISIS needs to be destroyed. But ISIS is part of a multidimensional equation there. And prior to ISIS's existence, really, or strength, the government was having terrible problems, and the war began before that. So there are multiple levels here. The simple statement one can extract from this is that to say that the anti-ISIS coalition is supporting ISIS is just totally untrue. After that, there are overlapping, competing claims and interests. But at least Damascus and Washington actually both oppose ISIS. Washington is not a friend of Syria and vice versa, but the first statement is not true.
All right, let me go back really quickly to get some perspective on this, the U.S.-Syria conflict, background on Syria's take and the U.S.'s take. Let's start with Syria's story first. According to the Syrian Defense Ministry, Syrian aircraft targeted in Rafah this Sunday. The pilot was killed. The Syrian Arab army was making progress to fight ISIS, but they say there was malicious intentions on the U.S. side in managing terrorism. Flip side, let's go to the U.S.'s story. Here's what the Pentagon has to say, that Syrian armed forces attacked the town of Jadin. Then Syrian Democratic Forces included Kurds and Arab fighters. Then the U.S. responded by flying its aircraft low in the show of force. The U.S. then contacted Russia to escalate the situation. And then 2 hours after that, Syrian forces, they bombed the SDF, then a Super Hornet from the U.S. Air Force shoots down the Syrian aircraft. So let's let those graphics and visuals continue playing just to give a balanced perspective on both sides, what the Syrian and the U.S. side have to say, and perhaps some of the background. In the meanwhile, I'm going to bring in Ramesh as well back in. Ramesh, as we mentioned, you were there on the ground not too long ago. How much of an advancement do you think the Syrian forces were making there in their offensive to crush ISIS?
Indeed, Archit, the focus of the operations, as it were, today is focused or centered around Raqqa, the de facto capital of the so-called Islamic State. And as President Assad himself said in the interview, it's a matter of time, a matter of few months before the IS is completely pushed out of sovereign Syrian territory. But to my mind, Archit, the paradox here is that while both Syria and the US describe the IS as their common enemy, both stand divided on each side of the aisle, as it were, and both are seeming to work at contrarian purposes here in Syria. And the good example of that would be candidate Trump's remarks as opposed to President Trump. If I can just go through the tweets he posted in 2013, and most notably the one issued on 31st August 2013, where candidate Trump says, and I quote, "The president," by that he means Obama, "must get congressional approval before attacking Syria. Big mistake if it does not, exclamation mark," unquote. And today, look, in 2017, he's gone ahead and done just the opposite. So clearly, there's a lot of, it raises a lot of questions,
right?
More than answers a lot of our queries.
All right, and really quickly, I also want to bring the Russia perspective. This news, of course, just coming in after all of this incident took place over the weekend. Russia's decision to treat the targets as well as the U.S.-led coalition flying over the Syrian battle zone has now serious implications. It holds the risk of the U.S. and Russia actually perhaps going to war in support of their allies on the ground. Russia's demands. Russia has prescribed the action as military aggression. It has now suspended all cooperation with the U.S. It has now demanded that the U.S. investigate the incident and share its results with Russia. It has also said the U.S. action has violated Syria's sovereignty. The U.S. action puts in peril the MOU that it signed 2 years ago with Russia on preventing air incidents. Russia threatening to suspend the agreement when the U.S. attacked Syria's Shayrat air base back in April. But the hotline between the two sides still continues. Now, it's not clear how long Russia's current action will be, but it has underscored the risk of a broader conflict between the two world superpowers. So certainly very interesting. Let me bring Dr. Abbas back into the conversation really quickly. Let's talk about this, the risk of the two world superpowers of actually going to war, two different allies. But is this now greater than before based on what we just heard and what we've seen between U.S. and Russia?
There is different view for that. You have to understand the Russian forces came to Syrian ground by legal way, by the request of our government. Who invite America to come to our ground? They will take the lesson in future soon, and you will see what will happen. American policy in Middle East is correct policy and foolish policy because they are facing problem maybe in their their department in America. They would like to shift this problem outside of their country, but they will face big problem in Syria in future, and we'll see what will happen. Our alliance announced that will not stay quiet, and we will choose the time and the place to give our action against this bad operation.
All right.
We are fighting against terrorism, and everything is clear now. Who is with the terrorism and who is against terrorism. And in this moment, please allow me to to say that Mr. Modi announced about terrorism. There is no good terrorism and no bad terrorism. And America and its ally from Qatar, for example, support good terrorism, and Saudi Arabia support bad terrorism, but all support the terrorism in the ground.
All right. All right. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but we're going to wrap this up really quickly with three final words from all of our guests. I'll start with Ramesha. Three final words to sum up this whole conflict. It's never-ending battle between U.S. and Syria, now Russia, into the dynamic. Three final words.
Archit, to my mind, it exposes the limits of America's influence in West Asia.
All right. Limits the influence in West Asia. Dr. Abbas, three final words to sum this all up.
We lost America in Middle East, and they have wrong policy, and will succeed and will reach the victory soon with our allies.
All right. And Glenn Carl, really quickly, three final words on the U.S.-Syria conflict.
Misplaced obsession on America. ISIS is doomed. Syria's regime will survive.
All right, very interesting dynamics, very interesting perspectives. Thank you all for all of your insights. With that, a quick short break here on Gravitas. More news and updates on the other side, including why Islamophobia is now finding a new home in the United Kingdom. We'll be right back.